Hello, I'm Harley Schlanger from the Schiller Institute, and welcome to this week's International Strategic Briefing from Helga Zepp-LaRouche, the founder and president of the Schiller Institute. I have to say, this has been an extraordinary last couple of days in terms of the unraveling of the so-called Russiagate investigation, the exposure of the web of corruption surrounding Robert Mueller and his investigation. As we've been saying since the outset of the attacks on Trump, during the campaign last year, this is coming from the highest levels of British intelligence. It includes the networks of Mueller and Comey at the FBI, Justice Department, and others. It's quite extraordinary, including the statement from the Deputy Attorney General yesterday in the House Intelligence Committee, when he said it doesn't matter if there's bias as long as they're able to do their job. So, Helga, this is exactly what we pointed out in the special dossier we did on Robert Mueller. Why don't you catch us up on these developments in the last couple of days?
Yes, this is very fascinating because exactly the opposite what was the intention is now happening, namely that those people who tried to prove collusion between Trump and the Russian government are now the target of a potential investigation themselves, with quite incredible implications. There are already calls out that all of these people, from Mueller, McCabe, Bruce Orr, Peter Strzok, and various other individuals, that they should all be led away in handcuffs. This is the demand of a former judge and state attorney, Pirro, yesterday or 2 days ago in Fox TV. And what she referred to is the fact that it now is becoming very clear in the hearings in the House of Representatives and in the Senate, that there was collusion of people who were absolutely a task force against Trump even before he was elected, who wanted to have sort of a life insurance against the possibility that Trump may be elected. And they worked basically together with the former MI6 agent Christopher Steele on this dirty dossier. Now, it turns out that the degree of corruption is even much more deep. For example, the wife of the recently laid off Deputy Attorney General Bruce Orr worked for the very firm which was dealing with Christopher Steele on behalf of the Clinton administration, the Obama administration, and the Clinton election team, namely GPS Fusion. So there is very clearly a conflict of interest, to say the least. And what happened in the hearing was basically the situation became so hot that McCabe, in the last moment, discovered a so-called conflict of his agenda, and he didn't appear. Congressman Nunes immediately said he does not believe that for a second, because obviously, it was incredible. I mean, the cover-up is not functioning anymore because, the questions were asked to these individuals that, they should have brought this information on their own. If there was an investigation against a president, they should have, basically prepared the material as evidence and not covering it up. So I think this is turning the whole situation around. Russiagate is crumbling, and this has incredible strategic implications, because this whole thing, if we recall how this developed, was all intended from the very beginning by the Obama administration and the leftovers from the previous Bush administration to prevent President Trump from developing a positive relationship with Russia. And once this is now turning against those who are the accusers, it opens a whole new strategic dimension.
What I'd like to do is just go through a couple of the things that came out, and including these incredible text messages that were sent from Peter Strzok, who was the former #2 counterintelligence official for the FBI, who was involved in the interrogation of Hillary, I should say, the friendly investigation of Hillary Clinton on the emails. he actually softened Comey's comments on Hillary Clinton, so there was no legal problem for her. He was involved in the Flynn interview. He was involved in meetings with Christopher Steele and the Fusion GPS. This guy Strzok is a walking conflict of interest. But the Inspector General of the Justice Department put out these pages, 90 pages, I think, of SMS messages. And in one of them, and this is the one that's most damning, he said to his girlfriend, Lisa Page, who was an attorney who worked directly under McCabe, he said, "I want to believe the path you threw out for consideration in Andy's office, that there's no way Trump gets elected. But I'm afraid we can't take that risk." Andy is Andrew McCabe. There was a meeting in McCabe's office to discuss how to keep Trump from getting elected by top officials of the FBI. I think this is absolutely unprecedented.
Yes, I mean it is a coup, and there was a congressman from Texas, Kretz, I hope I pronounce his name correctly, who basically warned Trump that this is a coup against him. And, basically, I think that is absolutely the case. I mean, President Putin of Russia already several months ago had said what is going on against Trump is exactly a Maidan. I mean, the kind of coup which occurred against the Ukrainian government in February 2014. And I think if you look at the personae, the relevant figures, then it's very clear it is exactly the same apparatus which was also responsible for the Maidan in Kiev. So I think this is not the end of the story, but an incredible crime is just being discovered and getting into the open.
And I think further, the whole question of Mueller and his role, we've played a major role in exposing that with our dossier, which we're now going to reprint. And people can get that and use it because, again, this is an unfolding story of a coup that we're ahead of. We can cut it off. We can end the coup if we do our job instead of letting them do their job. Now, I think one of the other really striking things in this whole thing is the role of where you see Fusion GPS, Christopher Steele, that he was brought in by Bruce Orr, the Deputy Attorney General, for discussion. So it shows that the Justice Department and the FBI back in August of 2016, maybe even in July of 2016, were working out an operation against Trump. Now, is any of this getting out in the media in Europe, as far as you know, Helga?
No. I mean, naturally, we are putting it out, but so far, I have not seen any coverage of this at all. What the media is playing up here is the election result in Alabama as a big blow to Trump, basically saying this is the end of Trump already in sight. So the picture, the European populations can have is quite the opposite of what is happening.
That's being kept out of the media because of all the focus on these other kinds of things is the recent developments around North Korea. What Rex Tillerson, the Secretary of State, said about basically open negotiations, that the U.S. is ready for that in cooperation with Russia and China. There have been some other developments around the whole North Korea question. What do you have on that?
Well, somebody in the State Department felt it necessary to immediately correct Tillerson by saying, yeah, that's true, but now is not the right time. So you can see an ongoing battle on every issue, even in the State Department, Tillerson is being contradicted. But otherwise, the situation looks hopeful. Naturally, the whole North Korea issue is extremely dangerous because obviously North Korea is now a full-fledged nuclear power. They have ICBMs which can reach every place in the United States and naturally around the world, many other places as well. And therefore, we are sitting really on a powder keg as long as the US and South Korean Japanese maneuvers are going on. But there is right now hope because you had both high-level representatives from the United Nations, from Russia, from China, and even the United States in Pyongyang. And therefore, if right now Pyongyang would really send a signal of not doing any tests for the next 60 days, and if the United States calls off this big maneuver, which should start at the beginning of the year, then this could really be approached. So especially if the Tillerson approach to sit down on the table without precondition is actually maintained, there is indeed hope. And I think it shows one more time how extremely important it is that the big powers, the United States, Russia, China, are working together, because there are several conflicts in the world which cannot be diffused if these powers are on a confrontation line against each other. So I think that it is dangerous, but it's also hopeful right now.
Well, and on this question of the battle against the attempt for Trump to bring us into a relationship with China and Russia, we saw two things in the last couple of days. One was Joe Biden's comments against the Russians in Italy, but then also this crazy speech from National Security Advisor McMaster, where he spoke at a British-American think tank that's committed to keeping the so-called special relationship together. And he said, geopolitics are back with a vengeance. I think he's answering you on that one, Helga, because you've made the point that we have to get beyond geopolitics. He went on to talk about Russian aggression, military aggression, and Chinese economic aggression. So it shows these coup plotters are still making clear what their intention is.
Yeah, Biden also claimed that the Russians intervened in the outcome of the referendum concerning the change of the constitution last year. And he was immediately refuted by the Five Star Party, by the Lega North, and by Berlusconi. And basically the political spectrum in Italy completely said Biden is completely off. But I think the truth is about to come out at many places. One other thing on this Russia question is an ongoing trial against the Berkutsk battalion, which is standing trial for a supposed criminal activity during this Maidan coup in Kiev. Now, the lawyer of this battalion basically has 2 or even 3 witnesses. These are Georgian individuals who claim that they have been hired as snipers by Saakashvili from Georgia at the time, and that they were ordered to shoot to both on the demonstrators on the Maidan as well as the police. And that confirms, again, our analysis of how this thing was completely orchestrated to create chaos and the condition for the coup against Yanukovych. So this is very interesting, because these people will be witness via telephone in a court case. Obviously, they don't want to appear and admit their deeds, but they are basically admitting what they did. And that means that the whole narrative on the Ukraine is also crumbling. I mean, Putin once said that if the Ukraine would not have happened, his opponents would have invented some other problem, some other story. And I believe that that's true. But as the history went, it was the Maidan, first of all, the 5 billion, which Victoria Nuland admitted was spent by the State Department in order to finance the color revolution in Ukraine already in 2004, the Orange Revolution, and then the Maidan. But the whole narrative naturally hangs on the fact that eventually on the Crimea there was a referendum and the population in the Crimea decided to be part of Russia. And that whole story was used to demonize Putin, to impose the sanctions. And, basically, if you now take it back and see that this coup was not, or rather that the actual trigger point was not the annexation of Crimea, as it is always portrayed, but that it was a staged coup where basically snipers shot on people on both sides. I mean, that unravels the whole story. So I think, I want to point our readers and viewers to a dossier we published about the Ukraine story as well, because I think the narrative, as it is called, narrative already means it's not the truth. I think the truth has to come out also on the Ukraine, and then the whole picture. I mean, it's like almost like a catharsis which is taking place, or what we see the beginning of. But sometimes such real cleansings are absolutely necessary.
Also, the proof that this had nothing to do with the well-being of the people of Ukraine is the complete dysfunction of the current government, and the fact that Saakashvili, who you mentioned, who led Georgia in a rebellion against Russia and triggered another crisis much earlier, they've been trying to arrest him in Ukraine, and his own organizers are saying they're going to overthrow the current government of Ukraine. I would like to call our listeners' attention to a very powerful report given by Natalia Vitenko, a good friend of yours in the Schiller Institute, that she gave at the recent Schiller Institute conference in Bad Soden. That's available on the Schiller Institute, New Paradigm Schiller Institute website for people to look at. We talked before a little bit about the Italian situation. You mentioned to me before the webcast, there's a new movie that's been produced, or a documentary, on the Monte dei Paschi case and the implications of this for the situation in Europe. What can you tell us about this documentary?
Well, I can only advise our viewers, to absolutely try to watch this movie. It's a documentary by Arte. That's the German-French TV channel. It exists so far only in German and in French, but the story told there is absolutely mind-boggling. The title of it is Death of a Banker, and it refers to the supposed suicide of a banker called David Rossi on the 6th of March 2013. And he was the communication manager of Monte dei Paschi, the oldest bank in the world. And this obviously occurred in the context of the big financial crisis of 2007-2008, where the circumstances under which a small bank called Anton Veneta was taken over by Santander, and basically Monte dei Paschi was thrown into this, and basically, an incredible amount of dealings and dealings, covering up losses with derivatives. I mean, this is looking like another case of Draghi saying, he would do whatever it takes to save the euro, when he said that in terms of the buying up bonds and quantitative easing. But this is another case where that question comes up, because it was Draghi in his function as a head of the Banca Italia who agreed to these dealings, as even if it was completely dubious. Now, obviously, this David Rossi knew about criminal activities in and outside of the bank. And the thing which makes this documentary so absolutely suspenseful is there is a video footage in there which was taken by a camera, which shows basically Rossi, the end phase of his fall. Then he lying dead on the street. Then a man who is another banker of the same bank coming by, but not even looking closely or trying to help him. Then walking away, coming back, telephoning with a mobile phone. So this is all really very, very dubious. And there is right now a new forensic investigation in Italy into the circumstances of this supposed suicide. Basically, initial findings say that he could never have fallen alone and be in the position how he landed on the street. His wife is very active. His family does not believe it was a suicide at all. she already posted this movie, despite the fact that it's only in German and French, on her Facebook site. It's going viral. The mainstream media are not yet reporting it, but this is an unbelievable story. And naturally, one implication is banker of Deutsche Bank, who 1 year later also was found dead in London, a person called Bröcksmith, who is, was involved in similar financial arrangements. So this was a case where it was said it's the Italian banking crisis which is a risk to the European system. But as the authors of this movie have pointed out, the Italian banking system was completely fine, including Monte dei Paschi, until basically Italy was forced to have a huge privatization of its banking sector to make the Italy ready for the euro. So I would suggest and would guess that this is not the end of it, because there are now criminal investigations into the circumstances. And, this is obviously another case, where you see the, criminal activity around this banking system. So I think our viewers should really watch this movie.
And Helga, this just underscores the whole point that what's going on in Italy, what's going on with the investigation into the Maidan, of the role in which the total instability of Europe is part of the reason for the coup against Trump. Because beginning with Brexit, we're seeing the disintegration of political parties in Europe, the loss of any kind of approach for a real production policy. We see the Chinese becoming very much involved in Europe right now. And I'd like you to give us a quick update on what's going on in Germany, because it appears as though there's still a very significant problem putting together a new government after the recent elections.
Well, it's now already 2.5 months since the election, and the first effort by Merkel to form a government with the Liberal Party and the Greens failed. Now, basically they are trying again either a grand coalition with the Social Democrats, but in the Social Democracy there is a lot of opposition against the continuation of a policy which almost, destroyed the SPD. And what the brilliant proposal by Martin Schulz, the head of the SPD, now is to form not a grand coalition, but a coalition, basically a cooperation coalition, which is the idea that they only agree on the points they agree and have then ministers on that basis in the cabinet. And on the points they don't agree, each side can be free to form opposition coalitions in the Bundestag, in the parliament, which obviously is ridiculous, because how can you be in the government and oppose your own government in the same way? And it would necessarily mean that on certain issues the CDU, CSU could only get a majority by relying on the AfD, the Alternative for Germany, which is this extreme right-wing party which has very dangerous elements within it. So I think this is a total instability, and obviously as long as you don't have a government in Germany, all the plans for Europe are null and void, because without a German government these plans cannot be implemented. What is on the table right now are basically various proposals which only differ in nuances. One is by Macron to have a European finance minister, a European budget. Then you have Juncker, who wants to basically put everything under the European Union Commission and build up this bureaucracy as a European government. And Martin Schulz, who says, yeah, we must have a United States of Europe. Now, this is a very absurd proposal. It was absurd all along, because there is no European people. There are many different cultures, traditions, languages, and people in one part of Europe have no inkling what's going on in another part, because they can't read the newspaper, they don't understand the history, they are totally uninformed. So it's not a European people. But if this was already dubious many years ago, it is completely impossible now, because you have the East Europeans, the Central Europeans, and basically people from the Balkans having a completely different attitude on the new Silk Road. You have Austria, where the new coalition government is even including a paragraph that Austria will cooperate with the Belt and Road Initiative. You have all Switzerland being excited to be cooperating with China in this respect. You had Hungary just now blocking a NATO-Ukraine Commission meeting because they don't agree with this policy of NATO encircling Russia. And, so there is no unity. And obviously, this is all because they don't want to look at the axioms of, their policy failures. Now, in the rest of the world, there is a growing awareness that Europe is not functioning. But I think it does require, a real policy discussion. What are the principles of the economy? What is in the interest of the people? How should we form a policy, a vision for the future? And none of these things has been addressed by the present coalition discussions in Germany. But there is a growing demand coming from the industry, from the Mittelstand, and naturally the Schiller Institute is conducting various events to try to make the policy of the Silk Road more known. And once people know more the absolute advantages of cooperating with the Belt and Road Initiative, for example, in the reconstruction of Syria, which is now seriously on the table, especially because of the role of Russia and China, and naturally the need to cooperate in the development of Africa. The problem is, rather than joining hands in a win-win cooperation with China, what Brussels and unfortunately also Berlin are saying is they feel that they have to be in a geopolitical competition. And I think this problem of thinking in terms of geopolitical terms is the main obstacle. Because if you look at the long arc of human history, it is very clear that unless we develop a vision of the one humanity working towards the common aims of mankind, we are not going to make it, and we are, always in the danger of war. And in the time of thermonuclear weapons, this could be absolutely fatal for the human race. So we have to develop a different perspective of how nations can cooperate.
I think we have a perfect example of that coming from China right now. There was a discussion about an investment in upgrading, or not just upgrading, but providing electricity for the more than 1 billion people in mostly Africa and South Asia who don't have it. And the Chinese were talking about a $1.5 trillion investment to do that. That's obviously aimed at precisely what you're talking about, the improvement of the future for people who otherwise have been given no hope. But I'd like to come back to one final point here, which again gets at this question of why they're trying to get rid of Trump. There was an announcement a couple of days ago by President Trump about the U.S. space program and his commitment to take the United States back to the moon and beyond, to Mars and to other planets, other galaxies even. And this kind of optimism was also seen in a China-U.S. conference on space, where there was discussion of the collaboration for the future, which, by the way, right now is not allowed because of the rules against the U.S. scientists talking to the Chinese, enforced by the same FBI that we've seen in this conflict of interest. So what are your thoughts on this great potential for the space cooperation?
Well, I think there is also an agreement between the United States and Russia to build a lunar space station together. And the decision by Trump was, you can really see who is who when you see how people react to that. ESA, the European Space Agency, was completely enthusiastic and greeted that. The Chinese government expressed happiness about this decision, while the European media basically covered it, as if Trump was completely crazy to go back to the moon. This is really incredible, and I think all the people who have been in space, the astronauts, they always come back and say, you know, this is an incredible experience, because in space, it doesn't matter what nationality you are from, because you have to rely on each other, because otherwise you can't do such an extremely challenging mission. And a Russian cosmonaut just basically said we should develop an attitude to solve problems on Earth with the same spirit like we cooperate in space. And that is a point we have been making for a very long time, that, you know, once you take the view that man is not an earthbound earthling, but that we are, you know, continuing the process of evolution by not only developing infrastructure across all continents, developing a world land bridge, but that the next natural step of infrastructure development is close by space, industrialize the moon as the precondition to have larger space flight to other planets. And, you know, that is the natural identity of man, that we are part of that universe and not just earthlings with limited resources. So I think it's a very optimistic thing that President Trump reconnected to the spirit of John F. Kennedy. And, you know, this is exactly what we have been fighting for, to close the negative cultural paradigm, which, you know, was the period between John F. Kennedy's assassination and, you know, basically the end of the Obama administration, where space was really on an absolute low burner, and, you know, no fundamental progress was made. So I think this is all the reason for optimism, and, you know, you should really basically help to get this message out, because the mass media are really keeping the lid on a lot of positive developments, which would give people an enormous optimism if they just knew about it.
Well, and to close on that, we've just put out a new pamphlet titled America's Future on the New Silk Road, which outlines why, not just, as you said, this is necessary, but how Lyndon LaRouche, your husband, developed the economic policy, his 4 laws on how we can do it. Without those 4 basic laws, we're not going to be able to take advantage of this, and that's a central part of this fight. So, Helga, this has been a very rapidly moving discussion today. I thank you for giving us this update, and I'm sure events are going to continue at this accelerating pace. So we'll be back again next week with the next Schiller Institute International webcast. Thank you.
Bye-bye.